Servus Männer, it's Red Pill Germany again. Today I want to talk about Turkey again. I wanted to make this video already half a year ago, but things got in the way. And now after the smashing defeat of the ruling AKP party under President Recep Tayyip Erdogan in important regional elections in Turkey, we could actually see some major developments in Turkey very soon. Remember my last video about Turkey where I reported about the mayoral elections in Istanbul. So today I want to continue where I left off last time and talk about the consequences or the events that were triggered by this election outcome. Then I want to talk about the underlying problems and show you what that means for the people in Turkey right now, how it affects their daily lives. And I really hope that you watch this video until the end because I want to show you some very simple, very powerful truths about the economic state of the country that cannot simply be refuted actually. Now, as a little disclaimer right at the beginning, I want to say this is by no means finger pointing. I don't want to mock Turkey or I'm not happy about the current state of the country. Even though I have my issues with many of them living in my homeland, I generally do not have a problem with them. Most of them are traditional family-oriented people actually. Plus, as you will see in the course of the video, most of the problems that plague Turkey are also our problems. So people in glass houses shouldn't be throwing stones. So don't interpret this video as singling out Turkish people or pointing fingers at them, but more as a sincere reminder that we should be vigilant in our own countries when it comes to these issues. But enough of this now, let's jump right in. So if you remember correctly from last video, the situation is now that Erdogan actually had the mayoral election in Istanbul repeated and his candidate, the AKP candidate, lost that election clearly. So now Mr. Imamoglu is actually mayor of Istanbul. That is of course a very prominent position and it allows his party, the Kemalist CHP, to fill lots of important positions in the administration and in the bureaucracy with their guys. And that is the currency of politics and the goal of every politician, you have to remember. Now it is always the same. I reported about that in Germany every time after these elections, and if a strong party loses seats in a parliament or loses key elections, the leaders always come under pressure because the herd follows them as long as they deliver results. And it is no different in Turkey right now. We didn't have to wait long. Old rivals of Mr. Erdogan, like the former President Gül and the former Prime Minister Davutoglu, are publicly criticizing Erdogan right now. There are also rumors of the creation of a new party that could pressure the AKP, and actually a lot of the current members of the AKP could go over to that new party. Now, I think the word rumor is actually way too weak, as I have actually read interviews where these politicians clearly say that they're thinking about creating a new party. I would say these are more than just rumors, it just means that they're openly thinking about it. So in the case of Germany, for example, you had the former splitting of the Social Democrats into SPD and USPD, and you also had the party Die Linke, which is also, well, not really split off from the SPD, of course, but they are a major competitor on the social democratic or left-wing side of the political spectrum for voters. Also, the AfD in Germany can be seen actually as a party that was coupled out or split off actually from the CDU of Angela Merkel, because many people there were fed up with Merkel's centrist or left-wing style of politics and they wanted to be in a conservative right-wing party. A very similar thing could happen to the AKP party now. So this is nothing new. Big, strong, powerful parties that ruled for a decade or even longer fall apart and their leaders have to resign when they lose a lot of elections and the rank and file of the party become dissatisfied. So what we could see is either that Erdogan is pressured to resign or the party could actually break apart. But the much more interesting question for me is actually, why are the people in Turkey actually so dissatisfied with their AKP leaders when most Turkish people in Germany are actually adamant fans of Erdogan? Now, the first difference that comes to mind is that the Turkish people in Germany don't have to live in Erdogan's Turkey. They just love to see the waving of the red flags from abroad, watching that on the television, and living in Germany where everything is nice and where they can benefit from the wonderful system and the wonderful institutions that Germans have built in our own homeland. So it must be something about the living conditions in Turkey, I guess. And as I said before, people were more than willing to look past all these things and ignore them for the moment, as long as the economy was growing and life was getting better. But once this stagnates or goes in the other direction, then people become dissatisfied very fast. So what am I talking about? A lot of people are, for example, complaining about a rather autocratic style of government and also something that we Germans call Vetternwirtschaft, that literally means cousin economy. It means that you fill powerful positions and influential positions with family members, or in the not so literal sense with very close allies and friends. From a Machiavellian point of view, that might be common sense, but if the only redeeming quality that these people have is that they're loyal to you and they lack the ability that they would need for one job or the other, it becomes a problem for the country. A prominent example for that would be the finance minister of Turkey, who is the son-in-law of President Erdogan. Now, I think as long as people are having jobs and their wages go up and life becomes generally better, people are ready to look past that. But once it goes downhill economically, they will complain about these things. Maybe people should complain about these things earlier, before it is actually too late. According to the official data that I looked at, the debt of the country is actually not so much the problem. They had a record high debt in 2001 and a very low debt of only 27% of GDP in 2015. Now it is on the rise again, but it is overall still a very low number compared to a European country, that is, at least. So I think economically the biggest problem of Turkey, and maybe the biggest problem period, is inflation. Yeah, that is what no politician wants to hear. They always want to pressure the federal bank to print more money and lower the interest rate. And this is actually a very recent battle that Erdogan had with the head of the Turkish central bank. He said he should lower the interest rates, and he actually fired him by presidential decree. I didn't even know he can do that. From a German perspective, this is scandalous because we Germans think about monetary policy and fiscal policy a lot different. Erdogan is more like Trump or like a French person. So generally, monetary policy is what the federal bank does, and their responsibility is to keep the currency stable and the prices stable. Their primary concern is not the economy or an unemployment rate. On the other hand, fiscal policy is part of the government. That's the finance minister, for example, who is in charge of fiscal policy. And they are making the budget, and they want also to stimulate the economy and buy votes. This is a very populist thing to do. This is what Salvini tries to do. This is what Macron tries to do. And also Donald Trump right now is always whining that if we just had lower interest rates, then our economy would boom even more. They do not understand, however, that that will only give them some short and mid-term benefits, and in the long run it will lead to instability and higher prices and less buying power for workers. The German perspective is that the central bank should be completely autonomous and they should not have to listen to orders given by the government. Now the French and the Americans and also Erdogan, it seems, have a different opinion. We have seen that Erdogan tried to bring in a lot of foreign investment and to boost the economy by a lot of infrastructure projects, such as the construction of the new mega airport near Istanbul. This will be the largest airport of the world, even bigger than the one in Atlanta, and I have to say I'm very impressed by this. As some of you might know, in Germany we also try to build a large airport near Berlin right now, and it is just a catastrophe. All the screw-ups in this construction and planning process are actually really, really embarrassing for all of us in Germany. So Istanbul is of course a very, very important large city, and of course they need a big modern airport. But does it have to be the largest airport in the world, I'm asking? Maybe it is the ego of the president that played a little role in the scope of this project. So in other words, the Turkish have been pumping more and more money into the economy, and we see that the inflation is really, really high. You can see that, for example, with the buying power that the Turkish lira still has. We see that common things like staple foods are getting more and more expensive. A prime example is something as trivial as onions, which can virtually grow everywhere and which is of course a staple food in Turkish cuisine. Now people were saying that they cannot afford to buy onions anymore. Last year I read many articles about sesame. Sesame is a very important ingredient for Turkish food, for baked goods. There are, for example, these bread rings that are covered with a thick layer of sesame. Sesame is imported primarily from sub-Sahara Africa, so they have to buy it in a foreign currency and not in Turkish lira. As the exchange rate of the Turkish lira to many other foreign currencies has been in free fall for many years already, it becomes more and more expensive as time progresses to buy goods from foreign countries, to import things. It has reached a point now where it really affects the private everyday life of people. The articles tell us, for example, that these sesame covered bread rings are more than just a normal food. It is really a part of Turkish identity. And when this is affected by the exchange rate of the currency, it really becomes a big deal for people. Now, I have heard that they try to fix the bread prices, or that the community actually fixes bread prices already in Turkey. So this is really an interesting situation, because I hope we all agree and we all know that fixing prices during a time of scarcity is nothing that has ever worked throughout history. There will be, of course, black markets where you would have to pay the actual price for a good then. And there is already talk, actually conspiracy theories, about evil businessmen hoarding onions and sesame and other things in secret stash houses to hide them away from the suffering public. So far, at least, I have not heard that they have found something, but of course, these speculations are very plausible, and a black market is actually what you would expect in such a situation. And of course, you can see that the international community and foreign investors are getting more and more nervous about the situation in Turkey. And one of the things is that key positions are filled with close friends and relatives, and also that the head of the central bank can just be fired when he doesn't agree with lowering the interest rates in order to print more money. That is something that doesn't really increase our trust, our confidence in the Turkish economy. And trust is very important. If I had investments in Turkey, I would become very nervous right now. And it is, of course, a go-to excuse of the elite of Erdogan, basically, to blame foreign powers and foreign influence as the cause of these economic troubles. In the second half of last year, 2018, for example, there was a pronounced spike in the exchange rate of the Turkish lira against the euro or against the dollar. Now, Erdogan was quick to blame the Trump administration and to speak of a conspiracy and an attack on the Turkish people. However, what I always do when I try to understand these economic things, I look at the zoomed out version of these graphs. I actually look at the long-time trends and not at individual short-term spikes. So when you zoom out, what do you see? Yeah, you see there was a steady increase of the price of a euro in Turkish lira, for example. And yes, there was this pronounced spike, of course, in the later half of 2018. Now, if you have a very untrained eye, you think, oh, that's an exponential function. So let's flip it around. Let's see how many euros you get for one Turkish lira. So the largest time series that I could find starts from 2006. Maybe you can find older data. I just had a quick look and I found this one. So you see, of course, it looks like noise, some spikes, a little bit of residual curvature. But these spikes are not really noise. These are due to current events. So these are the current events that fill newspaper columns and many pages. But you see, they are going up and down, so they really look like noise. Some spikes go up, some spikes go down, but what you can see is an almost linear decrease in the exchange rate here. So while we are all doing quantitative easing, we're all printing money, all of our Western nations are increasing the amount of money in the economy much faster than the amounts of goods and services. However, Turkey does that a little faster than us. They do it actually constantly faster than us. And this simple truth is revealed in this graph here. While the GDP of Turkey has of course been growing, it has not been growing as fast as China's GDP, for example, that was at a comparable state of development. If you look at the relative time frames of their increasing development, you can see that when the quote-unquote boom started in Turkey, they were growing like the German economy. The problem is the German economy is already or had already been a very developed economy, unlike Turkey's. Whereas China, that came from the state of a developing country in many places, or as a second world country, a Schwellenland, as we say in Germany, China had massive growth, while Turkey, in a correspondent time of development, only had a GDP growth that would have been nice for Germany, for example. But the currency exchange rate plot doesn't lie. And as the exchange rate cannot go negative, when you try to extrapolate this line, what happens if it closes in on the zero line? It becomes a catastrophe. And we see that already in daily life of the people in Turkey, where just common things of everyday life, staple foods become so expensive that you cannot afford them any longer. And as we can all imagine, this is when even people who are not really interested in politics or in freedom and liberty, people who generally don't care whether or not journalists are treated well and we have a free press, when they cannot afford their favorite traditional foods any longer, they also become dissatisfied, trust me. And if we look at that graph again, it is linear. Almost constant linear since 2006. So President Bush was in power back then. And all through the Obama legislation, it was the same thing. And now it stays, apart from a couple of, in the end, absolutely meaningless spikes. It is still the same constant rate at which the currency exchange rate falls. So Bush, Obama, Trump, it was all the same. So Erdogan has publicly proved time and time again that he doesn't understand the crippling and horrible effect that a low interest rate can have for a country. He just sees the short or intermediate benefit for a growing economy. But he doesn't understand the price that a nation pays for this hyperinflation. And yes, I think Turkey is suffering already from hyperinflation. And this is exactly what, in our German worldview at least, the central bank has to prevent. That is the responsibility of the central bank in the German system. So Steve Hanke, an economist, has written, for example, for Forbes magazine, that Turkey should do a similar thing that Bulgaria did in the late 90s, and that is replace the central bank with a currency board where the currency would be basically backed by gold. So in this way, no new money could be printed. Quantitative easing would not be a possibility, but you would really have stable gold-backed prices again. According to him, that helped during the time of hyperinflation in Bulgaria in the late 1990s. So I don't want to make this too long. Thank you all for listening. In summary, I can say that Turkey is suffering at the moment from a very high inflation rate, which is actually very common for a Mediterranean country. And the horrible thing is that this is not like this for a couple of years, but for at least over a decade already. Now we are at a point where ordinary people are affected because even staple foods are becoming unobtainable in usual quantities for many people. It is not so much the national debt level that is the problem here as I see the issue, but more a policy of relentless money printing and megalomaniac spending orgies. Pair that with an authoritative government style and heavy nepotism, and you can maybe understand why people are upset right now there. So I really hope that things will remain peaceful and nobody will get harmed, but I think we will see some interesting times in the near future already in Turkey. And with Christine Lagarde, who will probably be the next head of the European Central Bank, we could see some of the same policies and the same things being enacted in Europe as well, even more than we have it right now. So this already segues into my next video. I want to talk a little bit more about that in the upcoming video. Stay safe wherever you are, and also like, comment, subscribe, and also follow me on BitChute and Telegram. Links down below. Servus, Kameraden.